When my husband passed, I moved in with my daughter to help her. What they never knew was that the house wasn't theirs, the lease was in my name, and I had been paying $7,500 a month so they could save money. I never complained. I cooked, cleaned, and helped with the kids. Then one evening, my son-in-law snapped and shouted that I was a burden who needed to leave so his family could move in. My daughter stayed silent, and that silence hurt most. So I smiled, went to my room, and made a phone call. The next morning, movers arrived, not for me, but for everything. My name is Lillian Carver, and I am 72 years old. After my husband passed, the house felt too big for one heartbeat to fill. My daughter suggested I move in with them just for a while, and I agreed, grateful for the company and happy to help with the children. Quietly, I took over the lease payments, signing my name where the landlord pointed and transferring the rent at the start of each month. No one asked questions, and I didn't offer answers. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, mended small problems, and tried to make the house feel warm. I thought we were a family, a circle where everyone gave what they could. I never imagined that the very roof I protected would someday become the weapon used to push me out. She lived simply, spending little on herself so the rent never slipped and the bills stayed current. Birthdays were celebrated, school events attended, and meals appeared on the table as if by magic. She rarely reminded anyone that her pension covered most of the household costs. It felt ungenerous to keep score. Whenever the couple spoke about saving for the future, she smiled quietly, knowing her contribution had made that possible. Gratitude wasn't expected, just kindness, a seat at the table, and a sense of belonging. But slowly, she began noticing how her presence shifted from blessing to background. Her efforts became invisible, her sacrifices assumed. And invisibility has a way of turning into assumption and then entitlement. Over time, the tone in the house changed. Small requests became expectations. Appreciation turned into impatience. He began treating the space as his own kingdom, discussing future renovations, inviting friends over, making plans that never included her. Sometimes he'd mention how crowded the house felt, glancing at the spare bedroom she slept in, as though she were a misplaced piece of furniture instead of family. She stayed gentle, reminding herself that stress can make people careless with words. But in quiet moments, she couldn't help feeling like a temporary guest, even though every month it was her bank account that kept the doors open. The first sharp words arrived suddenly, like a winter gust. A forgotten dish. Shoes left near the door. Tiny things became reasons to criticize. He began sighing when she entered the room, as though her existence created inconvenience. The children sensed the tension and stopped asking her to read bedtime stories. Her heart cracked not from anger, but from the realization that gentleness was slowly becoming unwelcome. Yet she said nothing, not wanting to burden her daughter with conflict. She told herself families have seasons. Perhaps this one would pass. What she didn't know was that disrespect, once invited, rarely leaves on its own. The final blow came during an ordinary evening. A minor disagreement spiraled into raised voices, and suddenly he shouted the words that sliced straight through her. "You're a burden, just leave." He added that his relatives wanted to move in and she was taking up space. She turned toward her daughter, hoping for even the smallest defense, but there was only silence. That silence hurt more than the insult. It said everything. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply nodded as though he'd asked something reasonable. But inside, something steady and quiet began to rise, the part of her that remembered she had never been a burden at all. That night, the house felt colder than ever. Her daughter avoided eye contact, insisting things were complicated. She spoke about compromise, about keeping peace, about how it might be best if her mother found somewhere else to live. Not once did she ask how rent was being paid. Not once did she question the entitlement behind the request. The years of love, care, and sacrifice seemed to shrink into the shadows. So the older woman smiled softly, kissed her grandchildren goodnight, and went to her room. If they believed she was a guest, then perhaps it was time to remind them who actually held the keys. She closed the door, sat on the bed, and allowed herself one long, steady breath. There were no tears, only clarity. Early the next morning, she gathered the lease documents, bank statements, and receipts she had kept neatly filed in a small box. Every payment, every signature, every proof that the roof over their heads existed because of her. Then she called a moving company and gave them the address, her address. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply decided that if her presence was unwanted, so was her support. By the time the sun rose fully, the plan was in motion. And the balance of power had already shifted. The next morning, she brewed her tea as usual, calm as sunlight through curtains. When he came downstairs, still annoyed from the night before, she simply handed him a folder. Inside were copies of the lease, bank transfers, and the landlord's contact details, all in her name. He flipped through the pages, confusion turning into disbelief. It had never occurred to him to ask who paid. He'd simply assumed the world bent around his plans. She explained softly that the only reason the house existed in their lives was because she had stepped in when they couldn't afford one. No anger, no lectures, just the truth laid out neatly on paper. And for the first time, she watched arrogance drain from his face, replaced by something far less confident. By midday, movers arrived efficient, polite, and completely aware that they were working for the woman who answered the door. Boxes were labeled, furniture protected. Her belongings were packed with care. He hovered helplessly, asking why movers were needed if she was just leaving. She smiled gently and explained that the lease wasn't ending, only the generosity was. Without her, the house wasn't affordable. She was simply withdrawing her support and anything she had purchased. Shock rippled through the household as they realized how much of their comfort had quietly been provided by her. Kindness had never demanded gratitude, but disrespect had consequences. Later that afternoon, the landlord arrived to finalize paperwork. He greeted her respectfully, acknowledging the years she had paid on time, every time. Then he turned to the couple and explained, with businesslike calm, that without her signature and income verification, they did not qualify to renew the lease. The house would default back to vacancy once her notice period ended. The son-in-law sputtered, arguing that it was unfair. But leases do not run on ego, they run on legal names and numbers. Papers were signed, dates recorded, reality stamped in ink. She remained composed throughout, not gloating, simply closing a chapter that had already been torn. Only then did they understand the full picture. The furniture they sat on, hers. The appliances, hers. Even the children's bedroom sets had been quietly purchased by her pension. She gently pointed out receipts, not to shame them, but to make sure there was no confusion when the movers loaded the truck. Her daughter stood frozen, realization slowly thawing years of assumption. It wasn't wealth that kept them safe. It was one elderly woman's steady love and sense of duty. And they had mistaken that love for obligation, until it stepped away and stood on its own. Panic set in like a sudden storm. His voice rose, phone calls multiplied, and desperate plans formed all too late. He tried contacting relatives to move in sooner, but they didn't want to pay rent either. The truth was unavoidable. Without her, the house was unaffordable. The calm certainty in her eyes frightened him more than any argument could. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't dramatic. She was finished, and dignity wrapped around her like armor. Panic thrives where entitlement lives, and both were finally running out of room. Her daughter's expression shifted from complicity to heartbreak. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered apologies, real ones this time, unpolished and raw. She finally saw how silence had wounded more deeply than insults. Meanwhile, the man who had once barked orders now spoke carefully, his confidence punctured by truth. Even the children sensed the shift, holding on to their grandmother with quiet worry. She comforted them softly, explaining that love remained, but circumstances had changed. And sometimes change arrives carrying hard lessons. By evening, the balance of power had fully turned. He could no longer command, threaten, or dismiss. Every decision now revolved around the woman he had once called a burden, the only person who had ever kept a roof over their heads. She didn't seek revenge. She simply reclaimed what had always been hers. With signatures finalized and movers scheduled to return, the message was clear. Respect is not optional when someone holds you up. When it disappears, so does the comfort you took for granted. And for the first time since moving in, she finally felt seen. 2 days later, a formal notice arrived, stamped, dated, impossible to ignore. The landlord explained that once her tenancy ended, the property would be vacated. There would be no transfer of the lease, no grace period, and no negotiation without verified income that simply didn't exist. He listened to protests with professional patience, then reminded them that rent had always been paid by one person, and she had withdrawn. The words landed heavier than any argument. This wasn't revenge. It was reality, written in legal language and sealed with consequence. As he left, the house felt different, not like a home anymore, but like a ticking clock, counting down to empty rooms. His family soon arrived, full of opinions but empty of solutions. They demanded she do the right thing and keep paying until they could move in. But kindness is not a lifetime contract, especially when it's been mocked. Calmly, she told them the lease would close on the agreed date and no one else would be added. The house was not a prize to be passed around. It was her legal responsibility, and now her choice to release. Their tones shifted from arrogance to pleading, then frustration. She didn't match their volume, she simply repeated the truth. For the first time, they realized control had never belonged to them. Quietly, she also called the utilities and bank. Automatic payments stopped, cards removed, accounts updated. Every pipeline of support that had flowed unnoticed from her pension simply dried up. There were no arguments, just signatures and confirmations. When bills began arriving in their names, panic sharpened. He accused her of abandoning them. She replied softly that abandonment was asking someone to stay where they are disrespected. Support had been a gift, not an obligation, and gifts can end when gratitude does. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation dressed in calm resolve. The final week was a blur of frantic phone calls, budget spreadsheets, and arguments whispered late into the night. He searched for rentals and gasped at prices, deposits, credit checks, income proof. All the responsibilities she had shielded them from now stared back openly. He tried to negotiate again, softer this time, but respect requested after the fact feels like currency printed too late. She watched quietly, not gloating, simply letting reality do what words never could. Entitlement has finally met consequence, and consequence does not bargain. One evening, her daughter sat beside her with tears streaming freely, not dramatic, not performative, just honest. She admitted the silence that night had been cowardice, not neutrality. She confessed she had allowed convenience to replace loyalty. The older woman listened, and then did what mothers do: she forgave. Not instantly, not cheaply, but sincerely. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain. It was about refusing to live inside it forever. The apology didn't erase what happened, but it opened a door to healing that had been locked for far too long. She spoke gently but clearly about boundaries, the kind that protects love instead of suffocating it. She explained that respect is proven in hard moments, not speeches after the damage is done. If she ever helped again, it would be from a place of equality, not obligation. Her daughter nodded, hearing the difference this time. The lesson wasn't about money, it was about dignity. And once regained, dignity doesn't shrink back into silence. On the last day, the movers returned to collect the final boxes. She walked slowly through each room, not with sadness but with closure. The children hugged her tightly, promising visits. Even he stood quietly, stripped of bravado, aware that the house he once ruled had never belonged to him at all. She handed the keys to the landlord, thanked him for his professionalism, and stepped outside into clear air. Behind her, a house waited for new tenants. Ahead of her, a life waited, peaceful, self-directed, and finally free from the weight of unearned expectations. She chose a modest, sun-lit apartment not far from the ocean, nothing extravagant but peaceful in a way she hadn't felt in years. The first night there, she sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and listened to the waves rolling in and out like steady breathing. No raised voices, no tension. No one treats her kindness as currency. Just silence, the good kind. She unpacked slowly, placing framed photos on shelves, stacking books neatly, and hanging soft curtains that fluttered gently in the breeze. Independence didn't feel lonely. It felt like returning home to herself. And with every breath, the heaviness she had carried for so long finally began to lift. Routine began to weave itself back into her life. Morning walks, friendly conversations with neighbors, trips to the market where the clerk remembered her name. She volunteered at the local library, reading to children who adored her softness and patience. For once, her presence wasn't tolerated, it was appreciated. She slept deeply, without the weight of disrespect pressing against her chest. Peace isn't loud, it's quiet, steady, and warm, and now it wrapped around her life like a comfortable blanket. She realized she didn't need grand gestures from anyone. She only needed the freedom to exist with dignity, and she finally had it. Meanwhile, reality continued teaching its lessons. Without her support, the couple struggled to secure another home at the same level. Budgets tightened. Moving trucks came and went. His confidence shrank, no longer powered by invisible generosity. He reached out once, less arrogant, more uncertain, asking for temporary help. She listened kindly, but didn't step back into the role of silent rescuer. Respect had to come first. Assistance without gratitude only builds bigger cages. He finally saw what he had lost: not money, not housing, but the steady presence of someone who had only ever wanted peace. Word spread quietly through extended family and friends. Not gossip, just truth. People who once admired his bold confidence now saw the cracks beneath it. The story didn't make her proud, it made her sad, but it also brought clarity. Those who had judged her for being too quiet now understood the strength behind silence. She remained graceful, refusing to insult or blame. The character, she knew, reveals itself without commentary. And slowly the narrative shifted, not toward humiliation, but toward accountability. Actions, after all, speak longer than apologies. Relatives visited her new home and were surprised to find her smiling, peaceful, lighter. Some apologized for assuming she'd been taken care of, never realizing she had been the caretaker all along. Her daughter came most often, carrying guilt, flowers, and a determination to rebuild trust. They spoke honestly now, without denial or excuses. Healing is rarely instant, but conversation by conversation, the distance between them softened. Motherhood, she believed, wasn't about erasing consequences, it was about guiding growth. And growth had finally begun. Eventually, her son-in-law admitted quietly, and only once, that he had been wrong, truly wrong. His words were careful, sincere enough, but late. Regret doesn't undo wounds, it only acknowledges them. She accepted the apology with gentleness, not bitterness. But acceptance did not mean returning to the old arrangement. Some doors closed not in anger, but in self-respect. And while forgiveness was offered, access was not. He walked away understanding that arrogance had cost him something priceless, trust. When the final utility account closed and the last receipt was filed, she felt a sense of completion settle in. Not revenge, not triumph, just balance restored. She had spent years giving quietly, and when respect disappeared, she had finally chosen herself. The true lesson wasn't about money or housing. It was about dignity, gratitude, and the strength of boundaries spoken softly but kept firmly. Life had turned, not dramatically, but steadily, toward peace. And as she watched the evening sun paint her new walls with gold, she whispered a simple promise to herself. Never again would kindness mean surrender. Just when she thought life had finally quieted down, a whole new chapter began to open. Stay with me. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Independence didn't feel loud or rebellious. It felt steady, simple, peaceful. She paid her own modest rent, cooked exactly what she liked, and arranged her days without walking on emotional eggshells. There was no one sighing behind her back, no one measuring her worth against convenience. She finally understood that independence isn't just the ability to live alone, it's the ability to choose your own peace. She decorated her new home with soft colors, second-hand furniture polished with care, and small plants that turned toward the sun just like she was learning to do. Each bill she paid reminded her that she was capable. Each quiet evening proved she was safe. And somewhere in the stillness, she rediscovered the woman she had always been: strong, kind, and never a burden. Healing moved slowly, not in a straight line, but in gentle circles. Some mornings, memories stung, not of insults, but of the silence that followed them. Other days, she felt lighter than air, grateful she had finally stepped out of a life that had asked her to shrink. She spoke often with her daughter now, honestly, openly, not pretending that the past hadn't hurt, but refusing to live there. Therapy, prayer, journaling, and long walks became part of her rhythm. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant remembering without losing herself. And every time she chose calm over conflict, boundaries over guilt, she felt another layer of hurt soften, replaced with quiet strength. With time, new beginnings appeared like wildflowers, unplanned but beautiful. She joined a community group, made friends her own age, and even started a small sewing circle where stories and laughter were stitched into every meeting. The grandchildren visited often, bringing drawings for her fridge and hugs that healed more than words ever could. Life no longer revolved around being needed, it revolved around being valued. She discovered new routines, new joys, and new purposes. And slowly she realized that endings don't always signal loss. Sometimes they clear the path for a life you were meant to live all along. Those who had once overlooked her began to see her differently. Not as the quiet woman in the background, but as the backbone who had held everything together. Respect didn't arrive in speeches, it arrived in changed behavior. Softer tones, genuine gratitude. Invitations spoken with warmth, not expectation. Even her son-in-law, humbled by circumstances, spoke more carefully, aware that dignity has weight. She didn't seek praise. She simply lived with self-respect, and in doing so, taught everyone around her what real strength looks like. Not loud, not angry, just unwavering. She learned that family isn't measured by titles or walls shared. Family is anyone who treats your heart like something fragile and precious. Some relatives drifted away when the financial support ended. Others drew closer when they finally understood her worth. Her daughter worked hard to rebuild trust, not with promises but with presence. They cooked together, laughed together, and sometimes cried together. A real family, she decided, isn't perfect. It's accountable, it shows up, and it never calls love a burden. Happiness no longer looked like grand celebrations. It looked like morning sunlight warming her kitchen table. It sounded like the ocean and children's laughter and the kettle gently singing. It felt like soft blankets, peaceful sleep, and knowing she could say no without fear. She didn't brag about her journey. She simply lived it, grateful that life, even after heartbreak, can bloom again. Quiet happiness, she realized, lasts longer than any applause. One evening, as the sky faded into lavender and gold, she reflected on everything that had happened. She had been called a burden, yet she had carried an entire household on her shoulders. She had been dismissed, yet she had stood taller than ever. Strength, she learned, isn't loud or dramatic. It's the courage to choose dignity when silence would be easier. It's walking away without hatred. It's loving your children enough to teach them boundaries, even when it hurts. And as the first stars appeared, she smiled softly, knowing this truth. A mother's strength is never measured by what she gives, but by when she finally decides to protect her own heart too.